You know, this is a black and white, two-dimensional picture from the Oasis on beautiful Lake Travis in Austin, Texas. It's actually a limited experience of the beauty of this place. I mean, it's much better in color and in three dimensions. I mean, when you just see it, when you're standing there, it's gorgeous. I mean, mansions and hills and trees and lakes surrounding you. But you know, that three-dimensional experience is actually a limited experience of a fourth dimension, time. You know, I've actually had many great memories in this place, all the way back to when I came here in college. And over the years, my family's had many great days on the lake, and then we've come to this place and had dinner and music and dancing and laughter together. I mean, it's incredible. My daughter even got engaged in this place. Now stop and think about it. This flat, two-dimensional black and white picture is really just a representation of a much bigger fourth-dimensional experience of life. And now imagine this. What if all of our experience in four dimensions of life, all the wonder, all the love, all the beauty, is really just a flat black and white representation of a fifth, sixth, seventh dimensional life to come called heaven? You know, that's actually what the Bible has been teaching us all along. And I believe understanding it really changes how we live and love and serve and how we care for God's creation today. Now, because I think that helps us understand this life. And that's what I think you'll gain if you'll stick with us through this series. God wants us to know that He's prepared a place for us. And it's more beautiful than you can ever imagine, but it's experienced in new dimensions of time and space. You know, as part of my research over the last 30 years, not only have I studied over 1,000 of these near-death experiences, NDEs, when people clinically die and come back, but I also compared what they said to the various religious writings and what they anticipated about the afterlife. So in my study of over 1,000 NDEs, they make about 40 common descriptions of the life to come. And then I took it and I compared it, these 40, to, for instance, the Buddhist Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Islamic scriptures, the Quran, which had a few correlations to them. The Hindu Vedas, some aspects of oneness that it talks about, several other things had correlations. The Zoroastrian Avesta actually had 5 out of the 40 correlate, but with all of them I found just as many or more discrepancies. But when I took a look at the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, the Jewish Old Testament prophets and the New Testament, what it says about Jesus, I found a full 38 out of the 40 descriptions correlating. And I want to share that with you over the course of this series because I don't think God just has started to reveal Himself today with modern medicine bringing people back from dead. He's been telling us all along. And I think the Bible actually gives us context to interpret these near-death experiences and understand what do they mean. Now, I know some people will still be skeptical, even hearing doctors and nurses and professors talking about this invisible place called heaven. And I get it, but here's something that I find interesting. You know, as a former engineer, a science-minded person, you know, I find ironically many times the idea of heaven is rebuffed in the name of science. And yet if you really look at where science is going, for instance, the Kaluza-Klein theory, a unified field theory, postulates that there has to be a fifth dimension for science to work as we understand it now. Brian Greene, in his book, The Elegant Universe, talks about how quantum mechanics works perfectly, general relativity works perfectly, but they don't work together unless there are 6 or 7 hidden dimensions to space. So if science is telling us that there are probably hidden dimensions, why is it so hard to think about heaven, this place beyond our dimensional understanding? Okay, so where's the proof though, you might be asking? Well, interestingly, what I found is when people die, they say they leave their bodies, but they still have a body, a spiritual body, but it's real. And then they travel often to this place of great beauty. But before they do, many times they say they are right there in the room, up above, usually up by the ceiling, watching their resuscitation. And they're able to make observations that can later be verified. Do you know that 900 scholarly articles by once skeptical doctors or professors have been written on these experiences in journals like Psychiatry or The Lancet, Europe's most prestigious medical journal? Cases like the woman in London that Dr. Jeff Long reports are talked about, like where she died giving birth, and she claimed that she left her body and was up on the top of the ceiling watching the resuscitation, and she noticed a red sticker on the top side of the ceiling fan, the ceiling side. And then she travels to this place of great beauty where God tells her, your son is going to live. She didn't even know it was a boy, and you must go back and take care of him. And when she comes back and resuscitates, she tries to tell the doctors and nurses of this incredible place she went, more real than anything she's experienced, and they didn't believe her. They said, oh, it's drugs, it's hallucination. But she kept on with this one nurse until she convinced the nurse to go, and the nurse got an orderly who got a ladder, and she said, go up and look on the top side of the fan and see if there isn't a red sticker up there. And sure enough, there was. Now, many observations like this have been made. And you may say, well, yeah, but how do you know these aren't just urban myth? Well, I talked to Dr. Michael Sabum, a once skeptical doctor, who actually set out to prove these were myth. And after 5 years of research, because of what people reported about resuscitation, he was a cardiologist, and they saw him resuscitating, and what they reported, he changed his mind. And he wrote an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in JAMA. And Dr. Janice Holden, a university professor, actually took these observations and did a study of near-death experiencers making verifiable observations. She studied 93 patients who had clinically died and claimed they were in the room, out of their bodies, making observations. Each one could make many observations. What she found is that 93% of the observations were completely accurate. 6% had slight discrepancies. Only one of the 93 patients she interviewed was really inaccurate. Radiation oncologist Dr. Jeff Long was a skeptic when he actually read Dr. Michael Sabum's JAMA article, and he started studying it for himself and has now done the largest scientific study on NDEs in 31 languages around the world. Listen to what he says to skeptics.
Some skeptics think it's impossible to study something that isn't a physical phenomena that you can visibly see and measure. However, I can assure people with those concerns that science broadly embraces subjective phenomena, and that's the entire fields, for example, of psychiatry, etc., subjective, qualitative, if you will, research. So it's very well established scientifically, very well validated, and very well accepted. A basic scientific principle is that what is real is consistently observed, and the overwhelming consistency of what's observed in near-death experiences strongly bespeaks their reality. The way I study near-death experiences, again with the best scientific methodology that seems to be published, is through a very, very detailed survey. There's over 100 questions that I ask. So in my over 4,000 near-death experiences I've studied, I'm not only getting a large number of near-death experiences, but we can look at them in a depth that was never possible before. Some people have wondered if near-death experiences are due to drugs or anesthetic agents. In having studied over 4,000 near-death experiences, the great majority of these people that had them were not taking any psychotropic, that is, brain-acting medication at the time of the experience. So there's no chance that drugs could account for what's observed in near-death experiences. Some skeptics have proposed that near-death experiences are due to hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen levels. Well, that's a reasonable hypothesis because, after all, at the time of a life-threatening event, typically you are going to have reduced oxygen levels in the blood as a result of the trauma or injury that led to that close brush with death. In any other altered type of human consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, psychotic events, you typically have confused sensorium. Experiences may skip around in dreams that are very common. You really have that hypo or decreased lucidity, and that's completely different in near-death experiences, which are hyper or increased lucid, tends to be very logically and ordered. I can't find a single skeptical explanation of near-death experience that any reasonable, well-informed person would accept as explaining near-death experience. One of the strongest lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience is they shouldn't happen at all. At the time of a cardiac arrest, when your heart stops, well, of course, immediately, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. It should be impossible to have a lucid, organized experience at that time, and yet by the hundreds, people have reported near-death experiences immediately following a cardiac arrest, and that is medically inexplicable.
So science is validating what the Bible's been teaching us all along. There is a life to come and a place of more beauty than we've ever imagined. And people say that they had a new body, a spiritual body, but with new abilities. Now, it's interesting. I think Paul in the New Testament actually writes about this. You know, Paul was actually a Pharisee, one of the Pharisees that had Jesus crucified. And Paul did not believe in Jesus, and yet on the Damascus Road, he experiences this brilliant, blinding God of light, like near-death experiencers experience, and came to realize he was Jesus. Paul goes on to write much of the New Testament, but I believe later Paul actually had a near-death experience. It's recorded in Acts chapter 14. He's in the town of Lystra, a Greek city. A mob turns on him, stones him to death. And it says this: they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town thinking he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got back up and went back into the town, which I think is just crazy. I mean, I just picture Paul like, he gets up and runs back in the town. What do you say? Like, I double dog dare you, stone me to death again. But seriously, I think this is when he had a near-death experience, because he later writes about that. In 2 Corinthians 12, he says, I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows, because he still had a body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding they cannot be expressed in words. Things no human is allowed to tell. Now, several fascinating correlations here. First, Paul felt like he was himself. He had a body. He didn't know if he was in his body or out of his body, because we're still ourselves. And then he sees things that he says words can't express beyond our dimensional reality. And he hears things that he says no one is allowed to tell. Now that's fascinating, because many near-death experiencers say on the other side they were given knowledge, like all their questions were answered. They felt like they fully understood all the questions of earth. And yet when they came back, they would say, I knew I understood it there, but it's like I wasn't allowed to tell it here, which is exactly what Paul says. And Paul also writes in 1 Corinthians 13, for now we see only a reflection, but then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. Now imagine that day. You know, imagine the day when you're fully yourself. And that's what many indie ears said to me. You've never been so fully yourself as that day when you come fully alive, fully known, fully accepted. You fully fit your home. And your home in a new body. No longer any disabilities, no more aches or pains, and new powers, new abilities. So that you can go and experience and explore all of God's beauty, all of creation. And actually, I believe that's what Paul explains as well in 1 Corinthians 15:33. He says, our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they'll be raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they'll be raised in, the word in Greek is dunamos, in power, in strength. They're buried natural human bodies, but they'll be raised as spiritual bodies. And Paul tells us exactly what indie ears say around the globe. They were fully themselves. They had a spiritual body, arms, legs, feet. We could understand and remember each other and recognize each other and hug and kiss. But we weren't limited in our abilities, not just 5 senses, it's more like 50 senses. In some cases, they described it as blended senses, because our bodies are raised, as the Bible says, in power. And in fact, you even see examples of this. For instance, John in the book of Revelation says, an angel took me in the spirit to a great high mountain. He showed me the holy city, Jerusalem. The wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were written the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Okay, how could John be up on a great high mountain and yet read the names written on the foundation stones probably miles away? Unless, just like Paul said, our bodies are raised in new powers of sight and smell. And listen to how indie ears I interviewed talk about it.
I was in this experience for what felt to me like many, many, many hours. But in fact, the entire thing was probably 30 minutes.
My eyes were obviously completely enhanced, completely strengthened.
It seemed like all my senses took on the other attributes of the senses. So even though I could hear it, it seemed like I could also see it with my hearing.
People talk about how their experience on the other side is more lucid, more aware, more conscious, not just 5 senses. Some describe it as having 50 senses. It's fully alive like we've never imagined.
It's as though somebody put a film over what we see here, and then a film was removed, and all of a sudden the brilliance is exposed